Good evening and welcome to Agenda on Manx Radio. I'm James Davis. On tonight's programme, dogged by legal delays and a lengthy investigation into the tragedy, the Solway Harvester inquests have finally been concluded. Tonight we take a look back at how the tragedy unfolded and became a long, complex and distressing case. What now for the families of the crewmen who died, and what of the ship itself, an eerie eyesore in Douglas Harbour.
It's 5 a.m. and I've got my sea legs on today for a spot of scallop dredging. This is Richard Gidney, the skipper of the Solway Harvester. Richard, whereabouts are we going today?
We're heading down just off the Isle of Man, about 15 miles south of Kirkcudbright. We're targeting queen scallops.
When celebrity chef Nick Nairn met Richard Gidney on the Solway Harvester 12 years ago for the TV food series Wild Harvest, the vessel was portrayed as a state-of-the-art scalloper.
The boat we're on today, the Solway Harvester, is a highly sophisticated, purpose-built dredger, and here's how it worked.
But its condition would soon deteriorate. On the Harvester, scallops were pushed through deck scuttle holes into the fish room below. In 1997, one of two scuttle lids was lost overboard and never replaced, the hole left open to the elements. Down below, bilge pumps should get rid of any excess water, but a missing cover caused them to constantly clog with debris. In addition, a flood alarm wasn't working.
Generally, you can stay dry most of the week on the other boats if you're an experienced fisherman, but there's no chance of doing that on the Harvester.
Former crewmen described the Harvester as a wet boat. Andrew Breen and Michael Walker spoke to BBC Scotland's Frontline programme, which in 2000 carried out an investigation into the sinking.
Sometimes you go down the hold and there'd be 2 and 3 foot of water. There'd be 3 or 4 times a day we'd have problems with the bilges because it was forever blocking up with just rubbish out of the hold. There was times where we couldn't get to it because the weather was too rough.
Clogged up pump just means that the pump's not working. So in heavy weather you'd be filling up with water all the time. The last time I saw the Solway Harvester was just before New Year. We were sitting in the harbour, it came in and it tied up next to us, and I had a chat with Wesley and asking him how my old boat was getting on, and he said it would be fine if he didn't need to empty the hold of the bucket.
The fishermen claimed it had been a disaster waiting to happen.
You sometimes grabbed the hold of the pipes and lifted yourself off the deck so that you didn't get your feet wet. In wild weather, they're probably one of the worst boats to be on in wild weather.
It was very, very scary. I always thought to myself that this boat could go down.
And on the same programme, Richard Gidney denied responsibility. He said the boat's condition was down not to him, the owner, but the skipper, Craig Mills, a position he retained throughout.
Well, I would say that possibly the owner should take more responsibility, and I certainly do all that I can now. But at the end of the day, it's the skipper is the master in charge of the vessel. And even if I went to sea on the vessel as the owner, I would be subordinate to the master of the boat. So it's up to the crew to ensure that all these things are done.
Skipper Craig Mills, his brother Robin, their cousin David, Martin Milligan, John Murphy, David Lyons, and at just 17, Wesley Jolly, the youngest member of the crew, all 7 of whom perished on that fateful night nearly 9 years ago. BBC South West Scotland reporter Willie Johnston has covered the entire Solway Harvester story. He recalls that tragic evening, the blackest day.
I think the main memory is being back on Kirkcudbright Harbour on the quayside there that night, and just realising the devastation that was unfolding when it became apparent that this ship, which had gone to sea to fish for scallops, to come back in again and unload her catch, that she simply wasn't coming back, and the 7 young men on board weren't coming back either. And the fishing community there that night, they were absolutely devastated. On the quayside, I also remember young lad James Gorman, who was one of the crewmen of the Solway Harvester, who should have been on board, and he wasn't because he'd been suffering from food poisoning. And he was sitting there in his car, absolutely forlorn, possibly feeling a wee bit guilty that he was safe and sound, his mates were out there. At that stage he didn't know where they were, but they turned out to be on the bottom of the sea. They were never coming back, and it was a horrible, horrible evening.
The sea was calm as night closed in over Isle of Whithorn, ending one of the blackest days in its history. Once the worst possible news of 7 deaths had been established, the job of comforting the bereaved began. David Clark from the Fishermen's Mission in Eyemouth came to offer support.
Just to offer a shoulder to cry on, and to share the grief that folk are actually feeling, to share their hurt with them. We like to think that we can perhaps contribute to that in many different ways and perhaps ease the burden that the community is carrying, not just the family, because the whole community feels what's happened today.
In this close-knit community, most people know at least one person who drowned, and now the inevitable question of why is being asked. Born and bred Isle of Whithorn man Captain John Niblock spent nearly 40 years at sea. He can't understand what went wrong.
That is a well-found boat. It's a large boat. That boat basically can go.
Contact was lost after 5 o'clock last night when we were heading for Ramsey Bay, just to take some shelter until the tide was right for Kakuba. It's a total mystery. The vessels are fit for any weather that we get here. It's a 23-metre vessel, and something serious has happened, a collision or whatever, but something has happened very, very suddenly.
What will be the mood in Kakuba here, and maybe more pertinently in Isle of Whithorn, come daybreak today?
Fiasco and disaster.
How do you begin to come to terms with a tragedy like this?
You never come to terms with it. You can't. It's the mystery behind the whole thing. It should never have happened to a vessel of that size.
What sort of impact does it have on the fishermen who are left here?
It's hard to explain. They just this total shock and you just can't explain, really. It's just total shock.
It was a tragedy which devastated the close-knit fishing community in the Isle of Whithorn. Community members came together, touched by tragedy. They came in their scores to mourn and remember. Parish Minister Alex Curry said their hearts overwhelmed, they felt helpless, void and empty, and how difficult it was to do anything to bring a form of comfort and solace to the bereaved.
Today, God remembers the families of Craig and Robin and David and John, of Wesley and David and Martin. And God weeps with them. And their tears are surely mingled today with his tears.
The Manx government paid £1 million to recover the bodies and the vessel from the seabed, something family members will always be grateful for.
They're very grateful to the Manx authorities for raising the wreck, in particular for bringing out the bodies of their loved ones so that they could come back, be brought back for burial. They're extremely grateful to the Manx authorities for that, but they're frustrated, or they were frustrated, with the length of time the legal process was taking, because that was compounding the agony, extending the agony of the families concerned.
Words cannot express the thankfulness that the families have towards the Manx government for all the support that they've offered through this, and for the early decision that they made to raise the Solway Harvester and to ensure that loved ones were brought back home. I just cannot express on the family's behalf how thankful they are to all the people of the Isle of Man for what they've done for us here.
Chief Minister of the Isle of Man, Donald Gelling, has said that they have agreed this in principle. They know that it is a more expensive operation than the one that's already taken place to send a camera down and inspect the vessel, but they are willing to pay for it in principle. The vessel itself is lying in about 38 metres of water. We know that because the marine accident investigators have been out to the site of the wreck and they've sent a mini submarine down with a camera aboard. They have pictures of it, so they have concluded that it is practicable to raise the vessel, and they think that it can be done, and obviously anybody's on board can therefore be recovered more easily. And I think the feeling, as Mr. Gelling expressed it, is that they share on the Isle of Man a marine tradition with the Isle of Whithorn and places like it. They fully understand why the relatives want the bodies returned for burial, and if the raising of the wreck can give them any comfort, then they're very happy to oblige.
It's been a very long and frustrating week. Various attempts to recover the bodies have been thwarted by bad weather. But in the end, it all happened very, very quickly and almost suddenly. This morning, we learned that there's a real possibility that instead of lifting the wreck out of the water, divers would go down to try and recover the bodies themselves on the seabed. That's, in the end, what happened. A dive team of 3 went off the salvage ship, the Well Servicer, about midday today, and remarkably, within about 2.5 hours, they had been able to locate the 4 crewmen who were still missing, as well as the 3 who'd been found previously, and bring them back up to the Well Servicer, and they were able to report to the families at 3:15 this afternoon that all their loved ones had been found.
What reaction, if any, from the families do we know?
We do know at the media conference were 2 of their representatives, the Reverend Alex Curry, the Whithorn minister. He was with them when the news was broken, and he said there were many, many tears, his included, and there were tears of relief at the outcome, because one of the worst possible outcomes of this would have been that the families had come over here only to find that a certain number of their bodies, not all 7 of their loved ones, had been found. They've got the outcome they were praying for.
Well, when we heard the news this afternoon, there were obviously many tears, myself included. These tears were obviously tears of relief in a sense that we now have our 7 men. The thing that we've desired all along in this, we've got 7 men to bring home for burial. The whole community has obviously shared in the grief that has been particular to the families themselves. We've all felt deeply for them in this, and we've all had our own pains too as we mourn the loss of 7 of our men in our communities. We've drawn strength from one another over the last 3 weeks. We've drawn strength from the wider community, and indeed, as I've already said previously, from the wider world, who have sent us messages of sympathy and support.
Men and women wept as the inquest was opened and adjourned at Douglas Courthouse. All the men were identified by dental records, and a pathologist confirmed the cause of death was drowning. After adjourning the inquest to allow funeral arrangements to be made, Mr Moyle offered his condolences before launching an attack on off-island governments, which, unlike his own, had refused to raise the bodies of lost fishermen from the sea for financial reasons. As the families prepared for the funerals, it was announced the operation to raise the wreck could take weeks or months due to the weather. A number of attempts were abandoned. The salvage vessel Well Server was stood down, although not until their crew held a ceremony at the sea at the site where the Solway Harvester sank. 2 wreaths were thrown into the sea on behalf of the salvage vessel's owner and the Manx government. The crew also donated £1,000 for the families of the victims, while the owner pledged to match the amount raised. After waiting more than 3 agonising weeks for their men to be found and returned, the funerals were a watershed for the community. The crew were finally laid to rest.
Today every place was taken in the parish church and the nearby village hall. Outside, hundreds more crowded round, straining to hear the service relayed on speakers as a stiff breeze came in from the sea. The Reverend Alex Curry led the service.
We mourn the passing of 3 of our own. They were not merely statistics. They were husbands, brothers, sons, and fathers. And we come to celebrate their lives today out of a sense of thanksgiving to Almighty God for all that they have given us in their short lives.
John Schooler spoke as a representative of the village. He said he had been urged by his own family to remember the liveliness of the young men and what they had brought to their neighbours.
We don't want everything to be sad and sombre, they said. This is not what these lads were. They lived life to the full, and that is how we want to remember them. And this is true, for the lads brought life and vitality to this village, and very often laughter.
Richard Gidney, who employed the crew of the Harvester, gave this reading.
I must down the seas again, the lonely sea in the sky. And all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by.
It was a verse, he said, that skipper Craig Mills had often read to his young daughter before putting to sea.
And the wheels kick and the wind song and the white sail shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face and a grey dawn breaking. I must down the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. And all I ask is a windy day with the white clouds flying, and the flung spray and the blowing spume and the seagulls crying.
The service at the Isle of Whithorn was for the Harvester's skipper Craig Mills, his brother Robin and cousin David. Earlier funerals took place at neighbouring Whithorn for Wesley Jolly and David Lyons. Services take place tomorrow for John Murphy and Martin Milligan, the remaining members of the Solway Harvester's crew.
A safety probe followed, as did a visit from Prince Charles to the Isle of Whithorn. But investigations intensified when the vessel was finally raised after a number of attempts. Government began talks with companies to raise the wreck, and after several attempts thwarted by the weather, the Solway Harvester's final sea journey came on a still June evening in Ramsey.
It's Tuesday, the 27th of June. The Solway Harvester has been raised from the seabed off the coast of the island. As it emerged, its nets could be seen hanging down and a lifebelt still attached to the deck. Overnight it was pumped out, and the MV Norma has now begun the journey to Ramsey. Once there, the Solway Harvester will be towed into port, and the task of trying to discover why she sank can begin. It ends a lengthy and costly recovery operation, which began after the scallop dredger was seemingly overwhelmed by heavy seas in January. The Manx government made the decision to fund the raising of the wreck, with up to £1 million being made available. The Chief Minister, Donald Gelling, explained why.
Over recent years of trawlers that have gone down outside our territory, that the families have had to gather round with their friends and other people who have made donations, and they have retrieved the bodies. Now, I think that gives certainly to me a signal that the families of fishermen do want their friends, family and husbands home. They don't want them left in the vessels, and I think this is a lead that we've taken, that we want to be able to assist in that operation.
The Solway Harvester was towed into Ramsey after being successfully raised from the seabed by the heavy lifting vessel, the MV Norma. Although the Solway Harvester was rusty and covered in algae, it was still largely intact, with its windows and equipment, such as floats and nets, still in place. Speaking shortly after the vessel arrived in Ramsey, Chief Inspector Dudley Butt said a detailed inspection of the vessel could now begin, which would hopefully provide the answer to why it sank with its tragic loss of life.
It's going to take some time to do that, I guess a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then after that we may need to do some stability tests, some incline tests, which the MAIB will probably assist us with, to look at the overall condition of the vessel. It's going to take some weeks, and people are hoping to get an answer tonight, I know, but the result of our inquiries will take a few weeks before we get the final answer. And we're doing it mostly because the relatives want to know what happened. We did assure them at the very beginning that the Manx people would do it, and there wouldn't be any cover-up, and we would find out the cause for them, so we're now well on the way to do that.
This boat was towed in very slowly, a very calm sea, one of those sort of bright summer, early June evenings, which the air is quite crisp and the colours are quite vivid. And all you could hear was this boat coming in, and it wasn't coming in, as I said, at a speed. It was going sort of pop, 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 pop as it came in quite slowly across the harbour. One thing that struck me at the time, most interesting, was a lot of people turned out to see this boat being towed in. We are talking about serious numbers, thousands round the Ramsey harbour. And the one thing that struck me as I was standing there, and you can hear it when you've got a pair of earphones on, you hear sort of the sounds coming through. There was no sound. They were absolutely quiet. It was amazing how so many people just went, that you could feel the silence, which you normally feel the noise, but this time you could feel the silence. It was quite a remarkable occasion, and I very clearly remember it.
Richard Gidney was finally arrested and charged in June 2002. He appeared in court charged with the manslaughter of the crew members who died. He stood accused of breaching his duty of care by sending them out in an unseaworthy vessel. In February 2004, he was committed for trial, and a year later, in April 2005, the trial began. After a long drawn-out legal argument and after a 5-week trial, he was finally clear. The trial collapsed. Acting Deemster Moran directed the jury to return not guilty verdicts and acquitted Richard Gidney. The judge said there was no case to answer. After the ruling, he gave this reaction outside court.
I can only say what I know what my family and I have been through over the last 5 years. And I can only imagine what the families have been through over the same period of time. What is so sad is that after all this time we still are no further forward and not really any the wiser as to what's happened to the Solway Harvester. In many ways, I regret that I have not been able to present our case, as I believe it would have exonerated Craig Mills and his crew of any blame for this tragedy. Thank you.
Relatives of the fishermen who died, though, spoke of their anger, devastation and disbelief when the announcement was made. Martin Milligan's father John had recently taken time off work because he was suffering from depression brought on by the trial. He said he felt numb.
We're both totally gutted. We thought we'd have got answers now, but it seems that we're not going to get any answers at all now. We'll always have this with us, and it'll always be in my mind.
Martin's mother Elizabeth said their hopes for some closure had been dashed, and said that while Mr Gidney had lost a boat, they'd lost a son, and that Mr Gidney would get his insurance money. As the island's constabulary vowed to learn any lessons that arose following the collapse of the trial, and relatives hoping to finally establish the truth about the ship's fate, awaiting the UK government's Marine Accident Investigation Branch report, Michael Maul tried to resume the inquest, but Mr Gidney refused to return, and he said those words Mr Gidney had uttered outside court now appeared mealy-mouthed and empty and hollow as the man who uttered them. He said he risked being branded a hypocrite and a coward unless he had a change of heart. A claim for damages against Mr Gidney had already been launched by the families at the Court of Session in Edinburgh, but that could not begin until the inquest was concluded. Mr Maul petitioned the Court of Session in Edinburgh asking for help to obtain Mr Gidney's evidence, and that petition was finally granted in February this year. Following a visit and inspection of the vessel by Scottish officials, Mr Gidney gave evidence at Kirkcudbright Sheriff Court in June.
Mr Gidney felt that Mr Moyle had unfairly criticised him in his remarks when attempting to persuade him to cooperate with his inquiries. By not voluntarily attending to give evidence was because he felt people were out to put the blame on him.
On Saturday, the inquest heard the vessel had experienced 3 flooding incidents in 8 years, and that while Mr Gidney had installed a bilge alarm in the fish room of the Solway Harvester, it was not working when the boat began that fateful trip. As a result, the boat's skipper Craig Mills was not alerted that water was rising in the fish room during the stormy weather. Mr Maul drew attention to other equipment shortcomings on the boat, including the fact the lifeboats on board had not been serviced for a considerable time. I do not have any comparisons to draw upon, he said. However, I would suspect that by any standards, 3 serious flooding incidents in the short life, 8 years, of this vessel might be regarded as somewhat excessive. The vessel sank, the court was told, because its reliability and safety had become compromised. He concluded by saying that while the deaths were accidental, he appreciated the families of the deceased in the context of this tragedy might well find the use of such word difficult to accept. Mr Gidney of Gatehouse of Fleet in Dumfries and Galloway said Mr Moore's comments were predictable. In urging the recommendations of the Marine Accident Investigation Board to be rigorously implemented, he said he hoped they would avert another tragedy, although acknowledged that would be scant comfort to the deceased. At the outset on Saturday, Mr Moyle said this was not a criminal trial, nor a civil one, nor a witch hunt, and acknowledged he couldn't record a verdict at conflict with the criminal trial in which the vessel owner Richard Gidney was acquitted. Mr Moyle offered his condolences to the relatives of the deceased, some of whom were at court, and commended them for their patience, their stoicism and their understanding. And outside the court, a spokesman for the families read this statement.
After almost 9 years, we are pleased that the judicial process into the sinking of the Solway Harvester has finally been completed. Despite a number of delays, we are pleased that the coroner, Mr Moyle, has been able to gather all of the evidence he required to give his findings. We hope that the recommendations made by the MAIB in their report and endorsed by Mr Moyle today will be acted upon by the fishing industry and appropriately enforced by the relevant authorities, in the hope that this will reduce the possibility of a similar tragedy ever happening again. The conclusion of this process will hopefully give us a degree of closure and allow us to move on with our lives. We would like to thank the Isle of Man authorities and the Isle of Man police in particular, and the family liaison officers from Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary for their continued help and support over the years.
I've tried to understand what these folks have gone through, and I don't think any of us can fully appreciate what it means to have lost a loved one in the circumstances of the loss of the Solway Harvester. There's never been a desire for blame. There's been a desire to understand what actually happened, that they then might be able to move on from this.
So 9 years after the Solway Harvester sank in stormy seas off the island, a coroner has ruled no one can be held to account for the deaths of the 7 crewmen on board. It would appear the story is not quite yet over. In recording a verdict of accidental death for each crew member, Mr Moyle said he could not say for certain what had caused the tragedy because of conflicting views from experts. And although the conclusion of the process will hopefully allow families to move on with their lives, it looks likely they'll now push ahead with legal action in the civil courts. The next twist in a long, complex and distressing case, one which has lasted for nearly 9 years, and one which for many will not have a satisfactory answer. Good evening.